When Sylvester Stallone and Jennifer Flavin walked into Studio 6B for The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, the air carried a polished kind of energy, the kind reserved for iconic Hollywood guests and lighthearted interviews. The audience leaned in with anticipation, expecting playful stories from the past, maybe a few self-deprecating jokes, and Jimmy's usual charm wrapped in wit and timing. Everything was set for an evening of laughs, nostalgia, and celebrity warmth. Jimmy was prepped and smiling, cue cards ready, fully expecting to steer the conversation like he always did, with humor, rhythm, and just enough emotion to keep it human. But something shifted the moment Stallone took his seat. Maybe it was the way his silver cross caught the light. Maybe it was the quiet steadiness in Jennifer's eyes as she looked out at the crowd. Or maybe it was something deeper, an invisible current that runs beneath the surface when two people carry stories they're no longer willing to package for applause. The tone softened. The laughter didn't disappear, but it moved to the background. And what began as a late-night interview was quietly becoming something else entirely. It was quiet. And what happened next didn't just change the direction of the show. It changed the room. The kind of moment that can't be put on a cue card, because it can't be planned. It has to be experienced. And before we do that turn with them, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read every comment. And trust us, what happens next? You'll want to remember it. The studio lights inside 30 Rockefeller Plaza burned a little brighter that night. There was a subtle tension in the air, not the kind that crackles, but the kind that settles deep into the room, like everyone could sense they were about to witness something more than a typical late-night segment. Studio 6B had seen its fair share of legends, laughs, and staged sincerity, but tonight felt different. The audience shuffled in with the usual energy, phones up, smiles wide, but their eyes kept drifting to the screen above the set that read in bold gold letters, "Exclusive, Sylvester Stallone and Jennifer Flavin, Beyond the Spotlight." The house band wrapped their set, the applause faded, and Jimmy Fallon stepped into the light with his familiar swagger, suit pressed, hair perfect, smile wide enough to hide whatever sharp edges the script might hold. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice light, almost teasing, "tonight we have a true Hollywood power couple. One of them inspired generations with punches and grit. The other? Well, she built a brand while keeping her husband moisturized and marketable." A ripple of laughter rolled across the studio, more polite than genuine. Fallon leaned into it. "Please welcome Jennifer Flavin and Sylvester Stallone." Jennifer entered first, graceful, calm, dressed in ivory that caught the light without trying to steal it. Her stride was purposeful, but not aggressive. Her smile warm but measured. She shook Jimmy's hand, took her seat with the poise of someone who's navigated red carpets, boardrooms, and battles far more subtle than most would ever know. Moments later, Stallone emerged to stronger applause. Dressed in black jeans, a dark button-up, and a silver chain peeking from beneath his collar, he moved slowly, not out of age, but out of control, like a man who had nothing to prove but everything to protect. He greeted Jimmy with a nod, then sat beside his wife, one hand resting on his thigh, the other holding silence like a shield. Jimmy clapped his hands together. "So, Jennifer," he began cheerfully, "you've gone from modeling to mogul. That's quite the leap. What was tougher, walking in 6-inch heels or walking into board meetings with skincare contracts? Jennifer's smile didn't change. They both require balance, she said, and a sense of direction. Jimmy grinned, pleased with her poise. I like that, he said, then pivoted. But really, when you were posing for covers in the 90s, did you ever think you'd be running a business empire while married to Rambo? He looked toward Stallone for comedic timing. I mean, most women marry muscle, but you went and married the man who trained with a meat carcass. Laughter again, light, but this time a few faces in the audience shifted. Jennifer's eyes narrowed slightly, not offended, but calculating. I married a man, she replied softly. The rest is just stories people tell. Fallon chuckled. Touché. He turned to Stallone. Sly, be honest. Do you ever feel like the second most powerful person in your house now? Or are you still in charge when the lights go out? The crowd laughed louder, sensing the tease, but Stallone didn't blink. Jennifer answered instead, her voice like cooled steel. There is no ranking in a partnership built on respect. Fallon tilted his head, waving a cue card. Okay, fair enough. But look, let's be real. How often do people assume you're just the wife of Sylvester Stallone, not Jennifer Flavin, the entrepreneur? Jennifer paused. Often enough, she said, for me to stop wasting time correcting them. The results speak louder than introductions. That line landed. Applause broke out from the back rows first, then spread forward. Fallon smiled, but his eyes flicked down to the next card more quickly this time. All right, real talk. Do people ever ask if your success came from the Stallone name? Like, do you get tired of being tied to a brand that isn't yours? Jennifer didn't miss a beat. There's no shame in sharing a name, but I've built mine through different battles. Fallon nodded slowly, then looked back at Stallone. Sly, how's it feel watching your wife take the spotlight? I mean, Rocky used to be the hero. Now you're the guy. Cheering from the side. The words hung. Stallone shifted slightly forward. His jaw didn't clench. His voice didn't rise. But there was weight in the way he spoke. You think I'm on the sidelines? Jimmy raised an eyebrow, unsure if this was part of the bit. Stallone continued, voice low and calm. I've been in the light. Now I'm making sure she doesn't walk it alone. The studio quieted. Fallon tried to recover with a quick laugh. Man, you should write Hallmark cards. But the punch didn't land. Not fully. He flipped to the next cue card, but his hands were slightly tighter now. Jennifer, I read you used to clean apartments between gigs back in L.A., and now you're sitting here with a nationwide brand and a mansion in Beverly Hills. Ever just stop and say, wow, I made it? Jennifer's expression didn't soften. I don't say I made it. I say I kept going. The audience clapped again. Fallon, sensing the tone turning, leaned back, crossed his legs, and with a grin that almost sounded desperate, tossed out, well, behind every strong man is an even stronger woman, holding a serum, a spreadsheet, and probably a gym schedule. Stallone sat upright. His voice came low, gravelly, but direct. She's not behind me, he said. She's beside me. And if you're smart, you don't forget that. This time, the room didn't clap. They stilled. Jennifer sat taller, her hands relaxed but firm in her lap. Fallon exhaled through his nose and tried one more pivot. Hey, it's all love here, he said, laughing. I'm just saying, people tune in expecting to see action heroes. They don't expect, well, collagen queens and motivational quotes. Jennifer didn't even flinch. Maybe they should, she said. Because strength doesn't always enter the room with a roar. Sometimes it arrives and doesn't ask permission to stay. And just like that, the temperature shifted. Fallon smiled, but his fingers tapped nervously against his mug. Stallone glanced at him briefly. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't amused either. The audience wasn't laughing. They were listening now, and Fallon, he was losing control of the room. Jennifer sat quietly beside her husband, posture straight but not stiff, her fingers lightly touching the edge of her blazer, as if grounding herself. The lights above shimmered slightly softer now, or maybe it just felt that way, because the room itself had shifted. Jimmy Fallon, for all his experience and charm, was beginning to feel that he wasn't driving the conversation anymore. The rhythm had changed, not abruptly, but gradually, like a tide turning without warning, pulling the spotlight away from entertainment and toward something unspoken, something heavier. Jimmy cleared his throat and tried to reset the mood, his voice bright but slightly more tentative than before. "Let's talk legacy," he said, fingers tapping lightly on the stack of cue cards in his lap. "Sly, you've built a career that spans generations. Rocky, Rambo, Barney Ross, people tattoo your characters on their bodies. But now, as Jennifer's brand is growing like wildfire, do you ever worry that her name might outshine yours?" He grinned at his own question, the way he always did, like offering a wink to the crowd to say, "Come on, it's just a joke." But Stallone didn't grin, not even a flicker. He looked at Jimmy with an expression that didn't hold offense, but something closer to restraint. Jennifer turned her head slightly toward Fallon, eyes sharp and focused. "We don't measure our success by who casts the bigger shadow," she said evenly. "We built a home where we both stand in the light." The room fell into that quiet again. Not awkward, reverent. Fallon chuckled, but the sound didn't echo as far as it used to. Okay, he said, hands up playfully. "You two really are bulletproof. I'm trying to find a crack, and you just keep handing me lessons in modern love." He looked to the audience for a smile, and while some offered polite laughter, others just watched, caught in the weight of what was happening. He shuffled the cards again. "All right, let's talk about grit," he continued, voice firmer now, searching for footing. "Jennifer, you've shared before that you worked a bunch of odd jobs before modeling took off. Cleaning apartments, waiting tables, squeezing in auditions between shifts. How do you go from that to running a national skincare empire?" Jennifer's jaw tensed slightly, but she remained composed. "You show up," she replied. "You show up when you're tired. You show up when you've been told no. You show up when nobody sees you coming. And eventually, if you're lucky, you become the person who stops asking permission." The applause came again, stronger this time. Fallon nodded slowly, the grin on his face loosening into something closer to sincerity. He could feel it too now, that whatever tonight's interview was supposed to be, it had turned into something far more meaningful. "So let me ask you this," he said after a pause, voice softer now. "Do you think people have underestimated you?" Jennifer looked at him, then glanced briefly at the crowd, then back. "Every day," she said. "But that's not a burden. That's a head start." Stallone looked at her then, really looked, and something softened in his face. Not vulnerability, not pride exactly, just a quiet knowing, the kind that only comes from having walked beside someone through years of dust and fire. Fallon turned to Stallone again. "And you, Sly?" he asked, more cautious this time. "Do you ever feel Replaced? I mean, you were the image of masculinity for decades. And now there's this whole new wave, female CEOs, action heroines, a culture that's shifting. Do you ever feel like the world moved on? Stallone took a breath. Not shallow, not rushed. He adjusted the sleeves of his shirt, looked down at his clasped hands for a moment, then up at Fallon. It's not about being the center of attention, he said quietly. That's never what it was about for me. I didn't fight to be seen. I fought because there was something worth protecting. Fallon tilted his head, unsure of where to go with that. Stallone went on. You don't lose your place because someone else rises. You only lose it when you start believing you have nothing left to give. The audience didn't clap immediately. They just sat in it. Jimmy tried to shake the seriousness, reaching for his signature levity. That's deep, man. Like TED Talk deep. You sure you don't want to host this show? Stallone half smiled. Barely. Jennifer's hand rested gently on his forearm. Not for reassurance, but as acknowledgement. Fallon looked down again, and this time he didn't even pick up the next cue card. He just glanced at the cross hanging beneath Stallone's shirt, glinting faintly under the studio lights. You still wear that? He asked casually, nodding toward it. Yeah, Stallone replied. I've worn it since I was 19. Fallon chuckled. Not to get too philosophical here, but in Hollywood, doesn't something like that start to feel a little outdated? Stallone didn't blink. Faith doesn't expire, he said. Fame does. Applause does. But not faith. Fallon leaned back slightly, caught off guard by the directness. Okay, he muttered, half to himself. Didn't expect that answer. Jennifer looked at her husband, then at Fallon, and for the first time, her tone carried a distinct finality. People think strength is loud, but most of the time, it's just knowing who you are when no one else is clapping. The audience, silent again, erupted, not with wild cheering, but with that rare kind of applause that means something has landed exactly where it needed to. Some nodded. A few stood. A woman near the front wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered something to her husband. Fallon looked around, as if suddenly realizing he was no longer the host, just a witness. And somehow, everyone in the room knew it too. What started as a clever interview had turned into a mirror, a moment of truth, one that wasn't chasing ratings, but revealing values. Jimmy straightened his tie, smiled tightly, and said, Well, guess I'm the one learning something tonight. Then he laughed, quieter than usual. You know, he added, when I invited you two on here, I figured we'd joke about workouts, compare protein shakes, maybe get a story about how Stallone once headbutted a vending machine. The audience chuckled again, but softly. But what I didn't expect was this. He gestured gently toward them both. This much real. Stallone finally allowed a genuine smile to reach his face. Maybe that's what we need more of, he said. A little less noise, a little more real. The lights didn't dim. The music didn't swell. But something unspoken had already shifted in the room, and for once, even Jimmy Fallon didn't have a punchline to bring it back to comedy. The audience had settled into something no one expected, a reverent stillness. It wasn't the hush before a punchline or the pause between commercial cues. It was the kind of silence that only comes when truth walks into the room and sits down uninvited. Jimmy Fallon glanced at the stage crew, then at the clock near the camera, as if searching for a cue that would tell him what to do next. But there was none. No one dared to cut away, not while something real was happening. Fallon cleared his throat, trying to bring the energy back, though his voice was softer now. Okay, so we've gotten deep tonight. Love, legacy, faith. I didn't know I was signing up to be the moderator of a life symposium, he said with a half laugh, gesturing toward the audience, fishing for a reaction. A few people chuckled politely, but the room was still firmly anchored in the emotional gravity Stallone and Jennifer had pulled everyone into. Fallon turned to Jennifer, reaching for one last attempt to turn the tide. Jennifer, with everything you've built, all the respect you've earned, do you ever feel like people still see you as just the wife of a movie star? I mean, does that label still sting? Jennifer didn't rush her reply. She sat forward slightly, not to confront, but to clarify. Labels don't sting, she said, unless you believe them. And I stopped believing them a long time ago. She turned slightly toward Stallone. This man may have opened doors I couldn't, but I walked through them, built new rooms, and invited others in. That's what partnership looks like. The crowd responded with a slow ripple of applause. It wasn't explosive. It was thoughtful, earned. Jimmy smiled, but even he knew by now that this was no longer his show, not tonight. He shifted his attention back to Stallone. All right, let me ask you something a little personal, he said, voice dipping into a lower register. You've talked about loss before, about pain. You've played characters who've buried their sons, their friends, their own hope. But what about you, Sly? When the cameras aren't rolling, what gets you through the hard days now? Stallone looked at him for a long moment. He didn't blink. He didn't posture. When he finally spoke, the rasp in his voice was gentler, as though it were climbing out of a deeper place. I've lost people, he said. People I loved. People I couldn't save. I've lost time, too. Years I'll never get back chasing things that didn't matter. He looked down at his hands, then slowly back up. But I've never lost my reason, and that's her. He nodded toward Jennifer. She reminded me that strength doesn't mean not breaking. It means breaking and still showing up the next day. Fallon said nothing. He just nodded, slowly, as the crowd absorbed the weight of that answer. Then, in a tone that almost sounded like surrender, Jimmy leaned back and looked at the two of them as a pair, not celebrities, not headlines, just two people who had lived and survived. I gotta admit, he said, this wasn't the interview I expected tonight, but I think it might be the one we needed. He paused, then looked back at Stallone. Can I ask you one more thing? Stallone nodded once. When it's all over, the movies, the fame, the applause, what do you want people to remember about you? Stallone took a long breath. For a second, the studio seemed to lean in collectively, like every camera, every eye, every breath had aligned to this single point. I don't want them to remember me, he said. I want them to remember what I stood for. That you can be broken and still be brave. That you can fall and still choose to rise. That you can love someone fully and never feel smaller because of it. That's what matters. The words didn't need punctuation. They landed like stone on water, ripples expanding beyond the stage. The audience rose to their feet without being told. Some clapped, some just stood, hands folded. A few wiped at the corners of their eyes. This wasn't performance anymore. It was something else, something rare. Fallon stayed seated for a beat, then slowly stood. He looked out at the crowd, then back at Jennifer and Stallone. I started tonight thinking we'd get a few laughs and Maybe a story about Rambo breaking a rib, he said, chuckling softly. But instead, we all got a masterclass in love, resilience, and what it means to walk through fire with someone and come out stronger. He turned to the cameras. If you're watching this at home, rewind it. Watch it again. This wasn't just a segment. This was a moment. Then, in a move that wasn't scripted, Fallon walked over to Jennifer and took her hand with quiet respect, then turned to Stallone and clasped his shoulder. "Thank you both," he said, voice a little rougher now. "Not just for coming, but for showing up fully." Stallone nodded. Jennifer smiled with genuine warmth. And in the final wide shot of the stage, as the audience slowly began sitting down, the camera lingered just long enough to capture one last glance between the couple. A look not of victory, but of understanding. Backstage, as the lights dimmed and the credits began their slow crawl, a producer whispered to Fallon, "That wasn't what we planned." Fallon, holding his cue cards now bent at the corners, simply nodded and whispered back, "No, it was better." And with that, the screen faded to black, not with music, not with flash, but with a quiet quote appearing one line at a time. "It's not about who gets the last word. It's about who speaks when the noise finally dies down and still has something worth saying."